In this video we're going to be sculpting up a zombie using monster clay. Now this is a relatively new compound that came out a few years ago and I've always wanted to try it but hadn't quite got round to it, so I've been meaning to try my hand at doing a few more creatures, so now's the time, and after all it's called monster clay, so why not? If you just wanted a quick look at the sculpture, well, here it is, and I'm quite pleased with the way it's come out. However, if you're interested in seeing how I went about putting this together, then please do continue watching. It is quite nice to be able to have another go at doing some creatures. Quite a few of my projects recently have been sort of realistic sculptures and humans, so I haven't had a chance to sort of flex my monster muscles, as it were, and the difference really is that there's a much more wider variation of textures and things that you can put into creatures than you can into real people. So they often have very sort of leathery skin, quite textured sort of surfaces to them, which is quite fun to sculpt. You can obviously do a much wider range of body forms and expressions and just levels of detail in these things than you can with portraits of humans. My initial impression of using monster clay is that it's a little bit like Sculpting, which is a oil-based clay. Now the type of clay that most people will be familiar with will be water-based clay, so that's the sort of thing you might find commonly in art shops. But what you can also get is oil-based clays, so instead of being water-based they'll be oil-based. The difference is that water-based clays have a tendency to dry out as you use them, so you have to keep constantly re-wetting them to keep them moist. With oil clays that won't happen, so it will stay soft forever. Now obviously there's some advantages to that. You don't have to keep it moist, you don't have to keep spraying with water. It's also a little bit easier on the hands. It doesn't tend to dry your skin out quite as much as water-based clay does. Some of the disadvantages are though that because it remains soft forever, you can't make your final piece from it. So if you wanted to make a final figurine or something, you'd probably need to make a mould. Now other types of clay that I've used quite extensively in my videos are polymer clays. Super Sculpting is the most common. The advantage of those is that you can actually cook them in the oven and they'll go hard. So you can make your final piece straight from them, cook it in the oven, paint it up, and you're done. But with oil-based clays and water-based clays for that matter, if you want a final piece, you need to make a mould. So monster clay is quite similar to Sculpting and other oil-based clays, but there's a waxy quality to it, so I think there's actually a proportion of wax mixed into the clay too, and that gives it a bit of a different feel to other oil-based clays that I've used. And I must say I do like it. I think it's quite easy to work with. At the front of the clay does say that it comes in an ovenable tray. Now, I'm not sure if that means you can stick it into a regular oven, but I have seen people microwave it before, so that's what I'm going to do here. The clay is actually really hard before you do this, so I found it quite difficult to actually chip any out, and I actually managed to bend a sculpting tool and trying to do that, so I think giving it a bit of heat is necessary to actually be able to work with this. Once you've got into small pieces, I have found that it's quite easy to heat with your hands, but I think initially you do need to heat it up a little bit just to be able to scoop it out. Once you have applied a bit of heat to it, it really sort of feels like molten candle wax to an extent. What I have noticed is that the microwave seems to have heated it from the inside out, so the actual centre of the block of monster clay is actually really runny. And I would be careful here because I think it probably can get quite hot. But that's quite useful because, as you can see here, I'm able to just scoop it out with a spatula and start to paste it onto my armature. So as you can see here, I've just got a very basic head shape, and now I'm just adding some clay in to block out a neck and shoulders. So this is going to be a bust, so I'm just trying to get the basic shapes in place before I go any further. So there we go, there's a very basic head and shoulders shape. Now my plan for this is to sculpt up a skull first. The reason for doing that is I want to have all the skull detail in place, and then I want to overlay muscles and skin on top of that to sort of build up a face. But I can leave patches bare, so where the zombie skin has scraped away, you'll see skull showing through from below. So that's the plan. And I also think it's worth my having some practice at sculpting some skulls, because whenever I've tried it previously, they've sort of come out a little bit cartoony, so I want to have a go at actually doing something that looks sort of anatomically correct. was around this point that I started thinking that the pose of the sculpture that I had really wasn't that interesting. I'd had an idea for a sort of a screaming zombie with quite a sort of a protruding neck, so I decided to start repositioning the sculpture. So the first thing I did here was to sort of push the shoulders back as though he was sort of stretching and sort of thrusting forwards. I'm also cutting into the mouth and separating the jaw here so I can reposition it and have the jaw open as though he's screaming. But then I subsequently realised that the head was a little bit too far back. I wanted it much more forward as they were sort of leaning forward and screaming. So this is one of those situations that demonstrates that you really need to get the pose of the sculpture right before you start adding detail. I've started working on the skull here, doing some detail on the teeth and the face and things, but now I'm going to actually cut it in half and start piecing it together. So I'm sure I won't destroy all of that detail, but nevertheless some of the finer stuff that I've done here is probably going to get a bit squished. But fine, you know, if it makes the sculpture look better and more exciting at the end of the day, then it's worth doing. So hopefully you can see the sort of pose I'm going for here. His head's really far forward as though he's sort of leaning forward and screaming. And I think that's a pose that's got a lot more sort of motion to it than the one I had previously, where he's sort of sitting there sort of fairly stationary really. So now of course I've got two halves of the head here, so what I need to do is join them together. And the cool thing with monster clay and also other types of oil-based clay is that you can heat them up with a heat gun. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to heat the backs of the two pieces until they're more or less liquid, or at least quite soft. Then I'm going to squidge them together, so once they cool down they'll join together. So now that I've got that repositioned, I can start working on the sculpture properly. As I mentioned, I was paying particular attention to the anatomy of the skull, so I looked at a lot of reference for this, and something that became apparent to me quite quickly was that skulls seem to be as varied as human faces, which I guess shouldn't be a surprise, but it sort of was a little bit. They tend to have as much variation in their shape as any other part of human anatomy, so you can sort of do whatever you like to an extent with this. One video I particularly looked at was a video published by Tested.com, which you may be aware of. They interviewed a sculptor whose project was sculpting skulls, so that was quite useful to get some sort of 3D reference. And also halfway through this project, my fiance showed up from work with a real human skull. I was a bit scared to ask where she got it from, but as it turns out it's the skull of a colleague who displeased her, so I guess that's fair enough. Anyway, that was quite useful reference as well. So I'm getting sort of close to a sort of a finished skull type shape, I think. He does look rather happy, which was bothering me for a while, but sort of having looked at other skulls, I think they do sometimes look happy. It's something to do with the open mouth, I think, and perhaps the eyebrows, for want of a better term, or the top of the eye sockets. I think that's good enough for an underlying structure, so it's now time to put some eyes in. These are some eyes that I bought for a previous project, my Tywin Lannister sculpture from a few videos ago. They turned out to be a little bit too big for what I needed, but I think they'll do fine here. And again, without eyebrows, he still looks quite happy and maybe a little bit surprised, but hopefully that will change once we start adding in eyebrows and that sort of thing. So now the fun part, adding in flesh and muscles and that sort of stuff. I can actually recommend a book called Modelling the Figure in Clay, which you can see here. It's by someone called Bruno Lucchesi. I'm not quite sure how you pronounce that, but he does precisely this in the book. He models a complete figure through sculpting the skeleton, and then he adds on muscle and finally adds on skin. So he goes through the whole process in anatomical detail, and that was actually really useful when I was learning to sculpt. So I can thoroughly recommend the book. In this case I want to have some areas of the skull exposed, so I'm just trying to build up the face into something that looks zombie-ish but leave enough gaps and things so that some of my skull sculpture will still show through. I'd have to say that it took me a while to actually find the right direction with this. I think the problem I had was that because a lot of the face was missing, some of the reference points I would normally use to try and map out how the face should lie weren't present. So for example, there wasn't a nose, which meant that I found it quite difficult to sculpt in a screaming expression, because when you're screaming, the skin on your nose sort of comes up quite high as you scrunch your brow and the muscles around your face up. So because there wasn't a nose, it was very difficult to get the look of a screaming figure. I also realised that the teeth are way too large and way too prominent. So hopefully you can see that I've scaled down the size of the teeth in the jaw there. And I think that's sort of taken it from looking maybe a little bit cartoony to looking hopefully a little bit more realistic, or as realistic as a zombie can look anyway. So here I'm cutting in some wrinkle detail on the chest, and the way I've dealt with this previously is to cut in the details with the sculpting tool, but then to smooth them out by brushing some white spirit or other types of solvent over the clay, which will soften it up. Now, one technique that I've seen used by some people online is to actually use a heat source to smooth out the clay, and I've seen people variously use lighters and candles and things like that to do it. I'm going to use a blowtorch, why not? You know, this might be a bit overkill, to be honest, so I'm just giving it a very quick pass, as you can see, but I do find that this works quite well. It's quite a good way of getting some natural organic shapes. I mean, obviously if you leave the blowtorch on it for too long, you will just melt it completely to pieces. But I think it might be quite useful for having sculptures where you might want something dripping, like for example drool dripping from a dragon's mouth or something like that perhaps. So I'm adding some more tendon detail to the neck. I really want to make it look as though he's really straining and screaming. When you do scream, you'll notice you get various tendons and things standing up on the sides of the neck, and it just gives a look of tension to the piece if you add those in. I'm also putting in, I don't know what these are really, veins or maybe worms under the skin or folds of skin, something like that. Just sort of gooey, gruey detail that a zombie might have. So there we go, there's the final piece as you saw at the beginning of the video, and I'm very pleased with how this came out. It really started off as a sketch just so I could have a go at using monster clay, but I actually quite like how this has turned out. I like the pose, I like the level of detail. I hadn't originally intended to make a mould of this, but I think I actually will. So we'll be revisiting this sculpture in future videos, and at the minute I'm halfway through making a base for the sculpture, as you can see here, which is like a pillar of skulls that I've made. And I've done that by making a mould of some skulls that I've sculpted up and then melting monster clay and pouring it into the mould so I can quickly make lots and lots of skulls very easily. Anyway, I'll cover that in more detail in a future video. And I've also recently purchased a compressor, and I have a pressure chamber on order, so I'll be able to do some pressure casting soon, hopefully eliminate all of those annoying air bubbles. Anyway, that's for future videos, so for the time being, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Thanks very much for watching. I'll be posting more videos on this project and others, so if you'd like to keep up with what's going on, please do subscribe. Alternatively, you can visit my website, which is www.thedarkpower.com, or you can find me on Facebook, just search for The Dark Power.